Everybody, thanks for tuning into this quick color grading tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at 3 of the primary methods that I use for putting my LUTs to use, putting lookup tables to use in post-production to enhance my final color palette to get the best creative result possible, but also to mitigate the time, to reduce the amount of time it takes me to achieve those results. So we're going to be talking about 3 different things here today. They're relatively simple, but they do form sort of the cornerstone of my pipeline and of my workflow. And I'm sure many of you can relate or can take something from this, whether you're working on a small project or a feature film. Again, these are sort of the cornerstone, the pillars of using LUTs, at least how I see them. So I wanted to make sure I share that with you guys today, especially because I've had so many questions recently, just because I release a lot of color grading content on my blog, on my podcast, on my newsletter, and I've had a lot of people that are absorbing all this content respond and ask me for follow-ups, ask me for video tutorials like this. So I wanted to kick things off with this one here today. If you guys enjoy it, if you want more of this kind of content in the future, please do let me know. Just drop me a line on Twitter or email or a comment on the blog, and I'll be sure to address any future installments with your feedback taken into consideration as well. So just to jump in here for today, I want to look at, to start things off really, the first and most obvious use of LUTs or lookup tables, which of course is to achieve the creative look that you're going for. When you're dealing with creative LUTs, and just to make that distinction here for a second, let's talk about creative LUTs versus translation LUTs. A translation LUT is not really what we're going to be talking about today, but I'll just frame the conversation with this so everyone's on the same page. This footage here was shot in log on the Blackmagic Ursa Mini 4.6K. Normally what someone might do is before they start coloring anything, they see it's a very flat image, they might right click on their node here in DaVinci and go over to Blackmagic Design and find the LUT. So for example, you might go Blackmagic 4.6K film to video version 3. That's sort of the latest one here that I'm going to demo, and it'll add some contrast. It'll sort of get you out of that that really flat color space. That is the purpose. It's not supposed to give you a stylized look or anything like that. It's just supposed to make your footage watchable as if you shot it really in Rec 709, which is more of the standard color space for television. That's going to have a contrast curve applied to it and some saturation and so forth. I actually don't typically like to use translation LUTs a lot. I kind of do it manually, and we'll walk through that in a second. But again, I just want to preface everything with that is obviously not what we're showing you guys here today. What I do want to show you is the use of creative LUTs. So I'm going to reset that node. So we're back to square one here. What a creative LUT does is of course apply a look, a stylized look to your footage. If you were going to apply a look, and I'm obviously demoing this in DaVinci Resolve, but everything that I'm sharing here today could equally be applied to Final Cut Pro, Premiere, any software that accepts LUTs, which is basically anything and everything on the market today. But again, for the purpose of this, I like to work in Resolve, so I'll demo it here. We're going to right click on the node and go to 3D LUT. I've created, as many of you probably know if you've been following my blog, I've created a lot of custom creative looks that are available on my website, and I have them organized here into this folder. And I'll show you guys how to organize LUTs again in a moment as well. But I know, for example, this footage here that we're looking at is from my feature. This is just a bunch of raw clips I dragged into a timeline to demo for you guys. But this is from my feature film, and I know from coloring it already that one of the looks that I really like with this film is Summer 08. If I were to just apply that as it is, it will affect the image, but it's not the end result I'm looking for. It kind of has this sepia, washy sort of look to it, which is not what I want. I want a warm look, but I don't want it all to just be this giant color wash. So I'm going to undo that. The reason why that happened, obviously, is because I did not get this out of log. So it already looks washy. It already looks flat. So instead of applying that 3D LUT to it, that translation LUT from Blackmagic, I'm going to basically just do that manually. So I'm going to start by lifting up the mids a little bit. Some people start with the highlights or shadows. I actually find the mids are kind of my starting place. I like to bump them up a little bit and kind of do the highlights last because just the way I like to shoot, I often shoot and color my own footage, so that helps me protect the highlights. So I'll kind of get things where I need them to be exposure-wise. I'll push and pull a little bit. Then maybe I'll tweak the highlights a touch. And before I go too far with the contrast, I always like to add saturation. And the reason is sometimes an image actually doesn't need all that much contrast. It just needs saturation. So let's say we bump this up quite a bit. There's not a ton of contrast added to this, but if I just toggle this on and off, it's looking a lot better just with some saturation and a touch of contrast added, bringing up the mids, dropping down the shadows. By the way, what we're actually doing here is a correct order of operations. I've done a whole blog article on this. If you guys search it up on noamkroll.com, you can find it on the importance of your order of operations. If you do these things in the wrong order, if you do a secondary color correction before your primary, if you apply a LUT before you're supposed to, your whole pipeline gets thrown out of whack and you'll never be able to have the control over your image that you want to. So your very, very first step in any good order of operations is to create a base grade, just to neutralize your image. And we're kind of getting there. So this is looking okay. Sometimes what I'll do, I'm not sure if it'll work in this case, is I'll grab this little eyedropper just to see relatively where the white balance would sit. You can click on any area that's supposed to be white. This isn't going to be perfectly white, but you can click here and it actually worked fairly well. If it didn't, I would have just manually maybe pushed the highlights to be a touch warmer, but I'll just toggle that on and off. And you can see that's giving us a pretty good starting place. So now I'm going to right click here, add that same LUT as before. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, let me show you one more thing related to the order of operations. Her shirt here, it has this yellow happy face on it. It might be a little yellow, let's say, for my taste. It's actually fine, but let's say it was a little bit too yellow. I want to get rid of that before I apply any LUTs. I want to tone that down before I apply any creative look because it's just going to get harder and harder to deal with. So I'm going here to my Qualifier tab, clicking on here, hitting Shift H, and that's bringing up this view mode, which allows me to really isolate the yellow. So I can kind of reduce the width here, and I'll just do a really sort of quick and dirty version of it. You can adjust your softness on the low and high end of saturation and luminance. You can adjust the point of it. And if you never get it 100% perfect, like for example here, there's obviously some similar colors on the bottom right hand of the frame here. You can always put a power window over here to isolate that, so you can just do one of these so it's only affecting the shirt. I actually don't really care about that. Usually, typically if I'm trying to reduce one color and it's somewhere else in the frame, unless it's a really specialized commercial kind of thing and I'm just trying to pop the color of a logo or something like that, chances are I kind of want to do it across the board. So all I'm going to do now with that select is just desaturate it a little bit. So I'm going to pull the saturation down to around 33% or 33 on my dial here. And if I toggle that on and off now, you could see, so that's on and it's pretty vibrant. That's off. And it just sort of helps to kind of take the distraction away. Otherwise, you're kind of looking right there. It's a little bit more saturated than everything else. So now I'm going to add one more node, and this is at the end of my order of operations. So we've done our primary correction, which is basically just balancing it. We've done a secondary correction, which is fixing this happy face here, and we're doing our final LUT. So now I'm going to go back to that that same look that I wanted to use, that summer 08, and we're going to pull that up here. And now that looks quite a bit better. It's still pretty warm. It's still not exactly the way I want it to look. So I'm going to add another node, and I'm going to bring up the highlights because it's a little dark. And I'm actually going to cool it down because it might be a touch warmer than I want for this scene. And now I'm kind of where I want to be. So if I go into a full screen mode, just so we can see here, and I'll toggle this on and off. So that's the original. That's where we're at. That is pretty close. If I had longer, I would certainly tweak this a little bit further, but I am going for a very stylized look here. I want a warm look, but I don't want a washy look. I still want there to be some differences in terms of the color separation. I still want this green to register a little bit differently than the brown over here, and then her skin tone. I still want it to all be affected in its own way. So that's sort of the best way that I know and that I follow to use LUTs creatively, is just to make sure they're at the end of the pipeline, but that you're also leaving yourself a little bit of wiggle room to go in and make some little adjustments after the fact as well, because LUTs will sometimes get you the entire way there, but more often than not, they'll get you 90% of the way there, and you still need to do a little bit of tweaking after the fact because every shot is different and every LUT is different, and there's just so many combinations. The nice thing here is we isolated our happy face back here, so if we change our mind and say, I want to make this thing super vibrant, we can still crank it up, and it's going to look really ugly, but if we want to do that, we can. And it's early enough in the pipeline that it's not as washy as if we were going to try to now pull a key from this. It'd be a lot harder to pull another color key on the yellow here when everything else has a lot more yellow in it. So anyway, hopefully that was clear in terms of order of operations and applying those LUTs. Before we move on, I want to just show you guys, if you do want to put these lookup tables or any lookup tables in your master folder for Resolve, if you're working in DaVinci Resolve, it is very simple. You just go to, if you're on a Mac, I'll show you on, I'm on a Mac, so I'll have to show you on a Mac, but if you're on a PC, you can obviously do this as well. You just go through the folder structure in a slightly different way. On a Mac, you go into your library. So I actually like that. I just hit go to folder and then just have a / so that just takes me to my directory here. You can go into your library and then application support. Once you're in there, you're going to click over to Blackmagic Design, DaVinci Resolve, and then LUT. So this is its own folder. Anything that you put in here will appear over here when you right click in your main LUT menu. So sometimes what people will do with my LUTs, and I've actually done this myself in the past with my own LUTs, is if you download all of these, there's quite a few. I have 12 in each pack, and I have 9 packs now. So there's quite a few LUTs. People typically tend to find that they have a few favorites from every pack, or that a certain project really sits well with maybe 5 or 6 of the different LUTs. If that's the case, then you can always just make a new folder in here and drag your favorite LUTs into a subfolder, and then they're organized more effectively. So it's super easy to do, and they also will appear in other places within the software that I'll be showing you guys momentarily as well. But for now, let's just reset all of this here. And now I just want to move on and show you guys the second main facet that I wanted to explore today, which is auditioning looks. So I find this really helpful if I'm working with a client of mine, or even just if I'm sitting alone myself and I'm kind of unsure of what look I want to go for. I find that being able to audition looks, and I'll give you an example on this clip here, is a really effective way just to speed up the workflow and just to make more effective and decisive creative decisions. So when I say auditioning looks, I mean just trying different looks as quickly as possible, because sometimes we all have those moments where we've been looking at footage for too long and it's hard to tell. It's hard to kind of have our bearings and tell if we're going in the right direction or not color-wise, or maybe we haven't even started and we just need a couple of different options just to kind of get the creative wheels spinning. So what I'd like to do in that regard is essentially a variation of just clicking through here and cycling through the LUTs, but in a slightly more strategic way as far as the way that it's set up, so it doesn't take as long. Normally, like anything, I'll do a base grade. So I'll take an image like this, and again, I'll kind of use my method of bringing up the mids, pulling the shadows back down. We're just doing our basic correction here. Increase the saturation. It's starting to look decent, but it's pretty green, so we're gonna push a little bit more magenta in here. Maybe warm up the highlights just a tiny bit. And then let's take a look at that full screen. It is not perfect, but it's a decent starting grade, decent enough certainly for this demo here. Maybe I'll just actually bring the highlights up a little more. Okay, so let's say that's good to go. We want to start auditioning different looks. Normally, you could just create another node and start going through the looks. So say, okay, do we want Art House 1? It's kind of interesting, but I'm not sure. Let's try Art House number 2. And you can go through like this, and it'll eventually get you there, but it'll take a while to get there. What I like to do, and if you want to do this, you only really have to do this once. But what I like to do is just apply the look. So apply, let's say, you can go through to those art house looks that I had. So let's say Art House 1. Then grab a still of that, and you can even label it Art House 1 if you want to. And then you can go in and change that. Let's go Art House 2. Okay, we grab another still. So now we've got these two different looks. Now you go Art House 3. Again, you don't want to do this for every project, but if you set it up, whether you want to do it with all your LUTs or not, I'm just going to do it with these 3, for example. You can, when you're done, you can pull these all into your power grade folder here. So you can go Art House 1, Art House 2, Art House 3. So now when you go in here, any project that you're working on is going to have access to these power grades, and all you need to do to apply them is right click and apply grade. So you can very quickly, it's just so much faster. And also just it's more visual because you can look here and just see, okay, this one's sort of a little softer and, has some magenta. You can even increase this and just get a better sense of what it's going to do to your image. So I personally really like to work that way. For the purpose of this demo, I just deleted all of my own power grades because I want to show you guys building it from scratch. But again, that's kind of the best way to do it. The one difference in terms of how you may want to do it that differs from how I just demoed it is these grades also include this first node, which of course is the primary balance. So you may want to actually disable that and just apply the creative look. So then that way, let's say you're working with footage that was not shot on the Ursa Mini or that was shot in Rec 709 on a different camera, you can apply the look and you're not also bringing over the extra node, which obviously you wouldn't need because it would do some really funky things with your footage. And you can also display the node. So this is another way. I'm sure many of you guys know this, but in case anyone doesn't, if you ever find yourself in that situation, and let's say you already have footage that looks like this. So let's pretend we didn't do a grade here. Let's just say it came in from the camera looking like this. If you were going to apply this on top of that, which is basically appending the node graph, it would be way too intense because you'd essentially be doubling up on that initial look, that initial contrast adjustment. So what you could do if you're ever in a pinch is just display the node graph and just grab this one and drag it over here. So now you're just applying the creative look and not the original one. So again, these are all different ways to do it depending on how you like to work and what situations you find yourselves in. I personally find it is really, really helpful. Like I said, whether it's working with myself or with a client, just to speed things up and do this and get from not having any idea of what the look should be sometimes, which is a problem in itself, to having a pretty solid idea and maybe even having a finished or close to a finished product. So that's sort of arguably the number one usage of LUTs, especially when you're working with a producer or an agency or a director, collaborator in the room with you, let alone, again, doing it yourself. So hopefully that's all clear on that second point. I want to move on to the third point now, which is editing. So this is actually sort of a totally separate thing, but I tend to use LUTs all the time, as I'm sure many of you do, while I'm editing. This does not just apply to Resolve, it applies to Final Cut, Premiere, any of the other software I work in. As I mentioned before, obviously this is all being demoed in Resolve, so we're going to keep it in here for now. But one of the issues that people always have is they bring in footage and they start working with it, and it all kind of looks like this. Let's just pretend this is the scene. So we have, these three shots kind of in one scene here, and it's just not, it's just difficult to look at a certain point. Some people are affected more than others. Personally, I'm one of those people. I know that I can look at the image and I know logically this is a log image. This is not what it's going to look like when it's done. I can see where the color information is. I can picture the possibilities, but it still helps at a certain point to get a version that's even 60, 70% of the way there color-wise, because when you're staring at something all day, it's one less thing to kind of bog you down. So again, everyone's different like that. I know for me, it's important to be working with a version of the footage that looks as good as possible, even if I'm just working with proxy footage, which this is, by the way. All these shots are just low res, as you can see here, Apple ProRes proxies. So anyway, so let's say we're cutting a scene, and you could be in here. So we're in the edit panel and we're editing the scene, and it has these three different clips, and we get it relatively where we want it to go, but we're just having trouble moving through the scene, and we want to see it for whatever reason, essentially with proper color on it. So with three shots, we can sort of follow any of the other methods that I already outlined before. It wouldn't really be all that much of a problem. However, if you were in a scene which has 20 shots or 30 shots or more, as many scenes do, or at least that many cuts, I mean, you may have a scene with 100 cuts. You're not going to necessarily want to go through and individually color every single shot. So there's a few different ways to address that. The simplest way that I personally like to use is just by applying a LUT, 3D LUT at this level from the color management tab in your project settings. So the goal is to pull up the LUT that you want to use in here. Before you get there, you're probably going to be auditioning looks, as we just showed you in step 2, or point number 2, I should say. You're going to be able to sort of audition looks and determine the one that you want to ultimately apply to the scene. You're also going to follow the order of operations before, in that, let's say this is log footage, and obviously you don't want to start coloring it like this. You're going to want to get it out of log, or at least add some contrast first. The way to do that is to go here to the timeline settings. So if I click over to timeline instead of clip, I'm affecting every single shot in my entire timeline. So sometimes when people are editing a feature, for example, they may have a different timeline for every scene. Let's just pretend that's what this is. Let's pretend this whole timeline is really just these 3 shots and it's one scene. So we might go in here and just make a global adjustment. We're going to do that basic correction again, bring up the mids, drop the shadows a little bit, add a touch of a saturation here, and we'll start to get it looking decent. It's not quite there yet, so I'm gonna tweak it, bring up the highlights, neutralize those whites again because they are not quite where they should be. So let's say we're here. I'm gonna desaturate. It's a little too high. Relatively, again, okay. It's not a finished product we're working for today, but for the purpose of the demo, this is fine. So now if we click over to all of these, all the shots have that applied because we did it on the timeline level, not on the clip level, which is great. That's exactly what we want. So now we can basically blanket apply a creative look to all 3 of these clips. We can do it to the entire timeline, which is what we're going to do. But again, we're kind of pretending that these 3 clips are one individual scene that we want to apply with the same look. There are a few different ways to do that. You could select everything, you can apply a look. But typically what I like to do, so my timeline is still flexible and I can add clips and remove clips, and I don't have to worry about one by one adding a look as I go, is I will, as opposed to applying it on this level, which we obviously could, I'll go into my settings here for DaVinci Resolve. I'll go into the color management panel and I'll pull up the 3D output lookup table. And in here, all of my LUTs are in here, and they're not in those subfolders like they are with the right click. They just come in sort of by name. So let's say I want Art House 3. We'll just pick that one. That's one of my, another one of my custom LUTs. So we'll click Save. So now everything in the timeline, as you could see, just flipped over to have this look to it, which is a little bit more, has a little more contrast. The color palette's a little bit more distinct. And if we click through, now all of these have that look. There's still going to be a little bit of tweaking we may want to do because, you know, this one, her hat's a little darker and it's kind of, the shadows look a little heavier. So we may want to lift it up on sort of an individual level. But then we can do these micro corrections on each individual shot. But at the same time, the global effect of having this color palette that we wanted applied to everything is applied. And if there's anything that we find when we do apply it that doesn't work, let's say in this case it actually worked quite well, but let's say we applied it and we say, you know what, everything is just too warm, but we want to use the LUT, then we can go back to the timeline and we can cool it down because we're going to do this globally to everything. So it's just a really, really powerful way to work. And typically what I'll do when I start off any project is I will essentially do that process that I walked you guys through. I'll do the order of operations to experiment with looks. I'll audition different looks. So first I make sure my palette is neutral, then I audition looks, then I take the look that I've selected and I apply it to my entire timeline, and then I edit individual scenes with that look. So as I said, I can drop in as many clips as I want. I can delete this clip and I can drop in a brand new clip here, even from another scene if I want, and it's going to have that same look attached to it. So it's a really, really powerful way to work. It makes things a lot more quick, a lot more efficient, and it is, again, one of those sort of cornerstones of my personal workflow. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys to it. We've gone on for quite a while here, a lot longer than I thought. I hope you guys have learned something from this. If you're interested in checking out my creative LUTs, any of these looks that you see available, this is actually my full pack of all 9 of the individual packs. So I sell them in individual or in groups of 3 on noamkroll.com. So you can visit my site, noamkroll.com/LUTs, LUTS, and you'll have access to all of those if you guys want to check them out. Otherwise, as I said before, please do send me some feedback. Let me know if you have questions, anything that you'd like to see again in the future. I do plan on doing some more of these, so I'll look forward to hearing from you guys on that soon. Otherwise, check back the blog, podcast, and newsletter for more updates this week and for every week to come.